أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum dear students. I wish all of you will be doing fine and enjoying good health, and your family members would be doing fine too in this difficult time. So in the continuity of our previous lecture about public diplomacy, in our today's lecture like I would try to conclude this topic of public diplomacy. In our previous discussion we have talked about the various dimensions of public diplomacy, and today we will try to summarize this whole topic, and in the next week we will start talking about the practices of various countries involving public diplomacy, and we would start with the diplomatic discourse of China, hopefully. So without wasting further time, we would proceed with today's lecture. So, talking about the contents of today's lecture, in our today's lecture, we will try to cover two aspects of public diplomacy. One is the actors which are involved in the network of public diplomacy, and then we would talk about the key area of our today's discussion, and that is the future of diplomacy. That in the years to come, how would this public diplomacy will be responded and utilized by various countries around the globe. And then finally we would conclude our discussion about today's lecture, and we would also try to summarize the discussions which we earlier had in our previous discussions. Okay, so about the first aspect of our today's lecture, that is the actors of public diplomacy. So we being a student of political science, we are aware of the fact that most of the business of diplomacy and foreign policy, that is conducted by the state, and state actors are the one who have who undertake the affairs of diplomacy and foreign policy. And traditionally both diplomacy and foreign policy are deemed as the state domain. I mean, state is put in charge of dealing with the affairs of diplomacy and foreign policy traditionally. But with the passage of time, and with the rising wave of globalization in the international politics, and with the innovations in the means of communication and transportation and information flow, the world has converted into a sort of small village, and so many other actors have emerged on the international horizon, and most of those actors are termed as non-state actors. So that is the other actor which is involved in the network of public diplomacy and foreign policy in the current era of international politics. So both state and non-state actors have been discussed when we talk about the network, or when we talk about the when we talk about the affairs of diplomacy and foreign policy, not only the state actors but the non-state actors have also been involved in the affairs of conducting the business of diplomacy and foreign policy in the contemporary world politics. And talking about the various examples of the non-state actors, these include intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, think tanks, ethnic groups, and influential personnels as well. So, and when we talk about the emergence of non-state actors in the that comes under the domain of state activities, Joseph Nye, mm, it is defined by the National Intelligence Office of the United States in the following words: non-sovereign entities that exercise significant economic, political, or social power and influence at both the national and international levels. So these non-state actors, they play a very significant role in almost all the domains of life, whether it's political field, whether it is economic, or whether it is social domain. They do play a very crucial role in all the aspects of life, both at the national and the international level. The major strategy of non-state actors is to rely on soft power. In our previous lectures, when we were talking about how to conceptualize the term diplomacy or public diplomacy, we offered relevant terminologies as well. So, and we also discussed that public diplomacy is that usually rely on the soft power tools rather than the hard power. So not only this, the non-state actors like NGOs, multinational corporations, think tanks, religious groups, transnational diaspora communities do have a clear objectives, resources, means of communication, networking abilities, and human expertise to effectively carry out public diplomacy activities and strategies. So all these non-state actors, they are also equipped, and they are also equipped with all the resources and technologies which are required to conduct the business or conduct the affairs of public diplomacies. So state is not the only actor is which is which usually have the resources to conduct the affairs of diplomacy and foreign policy. So all the major capitals in this world have the head offices of NGOs and INGOs. Talking about the when we talk about the role of non-state actors in public diplomacy, Joseph Nye remarks like mentions this very aspect in the following words: these flexible non-governmental organizations and networks are particularly effective in penetrating states without regard to borders. Because and why they are quite effective in doing that, he says that because they often involve citizens who are well placed in the domestic politics of several countries, Such networks are able to focus the attention of the media and governments on their issues. They create a new type of transnational political coalitions. For instance, the coalition to ban landmines brought together NGOs, celebrities, and politicians in many countries. So, the different tactics and strategies are usually utilized by these non-governmental or non-state actors to penetrate in different states around the world, and they do operate by utilizing various sort of available resources at their disposal, including placing influential persons in different countries who can have access to different media channels and other political resources. So that's how mm, these flexible non-governmental organizations are operating very effectively in the contemporary world politics in general, and in regard to public diplomacy in particular. So, besides NGOs, there are terms like non-profit organizations, civil society organizations, self-help organizations, voluntary organizations, which are playing active role in the domain of non-state actors. So, beside the NGOs, MNCs, think tanks, and ethnic groups and influential personnels, there are other terminologies which are used for the in the domain of the non-state actors, which we just mentioned. So now public diplomacy is the number one priority of the diplomats and the governments, which they carried out with the help of numerous players. So public diplomacy has risen to a great significance and importance in the current state of international politics, and it seems to regain like more significance in the years to come. Okay, moving forward, now we will talk about the main aspect of our today's lecture, that is the future of public diplomacy. So, according to different professionals and practitioners operating in different parts of the world, they do have various ideas regarding the future of public diplomacy. So, according to Sylvia Koffler, spokesperson for the delegation of the EU to the United States, according to Sylvia Koffler, like once she stated that she stated about the future of public diplomacy in the following words. She says, I predict that the ongoing democratization of public diplomacy will not only continue but grow exponentially. So she is of the view that this increasing utilization of public diplomacy by so many countries around the world, it would not only continue but it would increase in numbers, and it increase in value and focus in the years to come. In the past few years, public diplomacy has already changed dramatically. No longer simply the purview of nation states, it is practiced by international and non-governmental organizations, regional governments, and other new actors. So, as we discussed just few moments ago, that traditionally diplomacy and foreign policy are considered state's domain, like, or it is considered the state's activity to involve with the business of diplomacy and foreign policy. But that traditional ideas have been changed already in the past few years, and so many non-state actors have come to the picture, and they are playing a very influential role in as far as the business of public as far as the business of diplomacy and foreign policy is concerned. So most of the practitioners and professionals operating all around the world, they most of them are of the view that the future of public diplomacy is very bright, and the importance to public diplomacy will be more and more states around the world will put more emphasis on public diplomacy, and they would try to engage in the practices of public diplomacy in increasing numbers in the years to come. So those who are associated with public diplomacy, either as professionals or practitioners, they are very much convinced about the future of public diplomacy in the years to come. So, for their conviction, following reasons can be mentioned about the promising future of public diplomacy. So now one by one we will talk about these various factors that can demonstrate the rising importance of public diplomacy in the future. The first one is like the utilization of public diplomacy tools by professionals and practitioners. More and more public diplomacy practitioners and diplomats are utilizing the tools of public diplomacy, and their number is on increase. It has a large number of governments from all continents which are making strategies and programs to fully use the public diplomacy to achieve their foreign policy objectives. Furthermore, governments are spending more resources on public diplomacy than ever before. So, keeping in view the pragmatic significance and utility of the various tools of public diplomacy, states around the world, they are putting more and more emphasis and resources to properly utilize the tools of public diplomacy, which has proved very effective and have played a very significant role for the states to achieve their national objectives. So the states around the world are on the track to spend more or utilize more resources available at their disposal to make proper benefit out of the tools of the public diplomacy. The second one is the increase in numbers of academics and scholars to write about public diplomacy. The researchers and academics from around the world, they are investigating or they are conducting research about the various aspects of public diplomacy, such as history, objectives, programs, challenges, the role of non-state actors, and so on, to reach at a point where they can come up with some sound solutions or some recommendations to effectively utilize public diplomacy by the states to get their national interests. New public diplomacy institutions, centers, and departments are mushrooming among academic circles as well as non governmental offices. More horizons are being exposed by the scholars and practitioners. First, it's public diplomacy, then the new public diplomacy, social media diplomacy, and new public diplomacy. So all these various terminologies demonstrate the ongoing research that have been placed in the domain of public diplomacy, and the researchers and scholars came up with different terminologies in order to better explain the trends and utilization of tools in the domain of public diplomacy. And still that uh, the, the research in this particular domain is ongoing, and countries around the world, they are investing so much money in this particular field of research so that they can come up with more sound recommendations to effectively utilize the public diplomacy to get the state's interest achieved. The next point we will talk about now is the scope of activities related to public diplomacy has increased as well. Now more and more areas are coming under the jurisdiction of public diplomacy, like fashion industry, sports, music, art, culture, media, and so on. So public diplomacy is not just limited to the state to state activities in the domain of political and economic or cultural aspects only. It has incorporated various other areas such as fashion industry, sports, music, art, and medias. So this demonstrates the rising significance of public diplomacy in the years to come. So that is another factor that demonstrates the promising future of public diplomacy in the years to come. The next one is the number of actors. To carry out the activities of public diplomacy, the number of actors involved in that has increased a lot. As we discussed, as we mentioned earlier, that traditionally state was the only actor responsible for conducting the business of foreign policy and diplomacy. But because of the wave of globalization and emerging of new channels of communication, so many other actors such as non-state actors have come to the picture, and they are also playing a very convincing and crucial role in this very domain. So the number of actors involved in the business of diplomacy and foreign policy, they have increased in numbers. So lastly, we will talk about the innovations in technology and media. Because of the new technologies and media, as the use of public diplomacy tools has also given a boost to public diplomacy activities. The Twitter accounts, Facebook, internet, YouTube are all being used as public diplomacy tools. I remember when we were having proper classes before the midterm exams, I instructed you about some of the latest innovations in the domain of public diplomacy, and various other terminologies are being utilized for as an alternate terms for public diplomacy, such as the political communication and the diplomatic discourse. So diplomatic discourse is something which we will talk about in detail in our coming classes, and we will talk about the diplomatic discourse of China and the United States of America, and what sort of tools are being utilized in the diplomatic discourse launched by the various countries around the world. We will talk about those in detail as well, and Twitter and these social medias like such as Twitter, Facebook, internet, YouTube are all the tools which are being utilized in an effective way by the various countries around the world under the banner of diplomatic discourse practices. So the role of social media cannot be denied or overlooked in the age of globalization. Nobody can deny the value or significance of the social medias in the contemporary world politics. Whether it is positive or negative, nobody can deny the role of the social medias. One can cite the role of Facebook and Twitter during the spring revolutions in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Now, diplomats and politicians have to be online to keep in touch with their goals. So, these social medias have been effectively utilized in so many cases and around the world, and we can find so many such examples that happened in that how effectively those social medias have been utilized by in different countries in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. So the significance of public diplomacy has come to a great significance in the contemporary world, and it is going to be increased as it is anticipated by most of the practitioners and professionals operating all over the world. So now we will try to sum up the whole discussions which we had in our today's lecture and our previous discussions. So in the 21st century, public diplomacy is considered as a tool to manage international environment. This is one of the theme of diplomacy, public diplomacy. The practitioners and professionals might vary on the goals of public diplomacy, but this is one of the common themes like to manage the international environment. Public diplomacy is different from traditional diplomacy as far as its scope and actors are concerned. It is a dialogue oriented and engaging the public rather than the one way flow of information from the state. So we also had discussion about this aspect as well, like when we relate when we talk about propaganda as one of the relative terminologies used for public diplomacy. It is different from propaganda because propaganda involves one way flow of communication, and the public diplomacy is something different from that because it involves a two-way process. It is not just a one way flow of information. The process of globalization makes public diplomacy even more important and indisputable, with the fact that more effective actors like global NGOs, multinational organizations, and intergovernmental organizations are more influential than the national governments. New means of communication further the role of public diplomacy. Use of social media is increasing. Those who wanted to communicate with public cannot ignore it. Embassies must develop their potentials to fully utilize the social media. Governments must pay more importance to public diplomacy and allocate more funds for the activities. It does not mean that every government use public diplomacy for every country, but it is recommended that priority must be given to those who are vital for the interest of the country. So this is something, this is one of the points which we might not have discussed in detail before. So if we happen to look at the practices of public diplomacy launched by various states around the world, we will come to know that one state does not always deploy the public diplomacy practice against every single state in the world. They only utilize public diplomacy, or they engage those countries in the business of public diplomacy which are crucial or which are important for their national interest. So similarly, even every state has to set its own objectives and strategies to achieve its foreign policy objectives. So here we can also mention that different countries around the world, they come up with different strategies and plan of actions, keeping in mind their ground realities and uh, the both the domestic and regional political aspects in mind. They, by keeping all these factors in mind, they frame the objectives of public diplomacy differently from different states. For the state has to engage more actors, so state has to deploy some non-state actors as well to get more and more briefing about various aspects of policies. Public diplomacy is the need of time right now. It cannot be done on ad hoc basis, neither it can be ignored. So keeping in view the pragmatic value of the public diplomacy in the contemporary world, neither it can be ignored nor it can be placed on ad hoc basis. If governments wanted to be on the top of their foreign policy goals, they must know how to fully utilize public diplomacy tools. So I would like to conclude my today's speech with this very statement, which is there on this slide of our concluding remarks, that owing to the pragmatic value, or owing to the rising significance in the contemporary international world, public diplomacy is the diplomacy of the contemporary world politics. So it has become an unavoidable fact of the contemporary world politics, and it, we can say that without the proper utilization of public diplomacy, states around the world might not be able to fully achieve their national objectives or national interests. So that's all about public diplomacy, and I already have shared some of the reading materials with you, and I would further share some of the relevant reading materials with you people, so that you can have a thorough analysis of this topic. And if you have any queries, you can raise your question in our WhatsApp group, which has been established earlier, and I would try to like address the queries in a proper and befitting manner. So wish you good luck, and I wish you all stay safe and healthy. mm, See you next week for further lectures. Until then, Allah Hafiz.